And I'm going to send around the sign-in sheet. You'll see the Wednesday sign next to your name, signature, not print. Okay, so we move on to the blood, and move on to the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular, what does that refer to? Cardiovascular. Cardio refers to the heart. Vascular refers to the vessels. Now, blood is what the cardiovascular system transports. Okay, so I mentioned blood as being FedEx trucks, and they're going to deliver stuff, and the cardiovascular system is how they're going to get to where they need to go. Okay, so we're going to talk about the heart today. All right, so chapter 19 is the heart and its structure. And what do you see here? This is, how many of you are in nursing? All right, athletic training, DMS, all right? So all of this, you'll get used to seeing things like this, right? Pre-med, all right? All of it. This is a normal chest x-ray, okay? You see of the thoracic cavity, you see the thoracic cage, right? And then you see this kind of thing right here in the middle. Actually, I'll move it up a little bit so you can see it. That right there, now outline it in red. This right here is the heart, okay? The heart is located within what we call the mediastinum. Now, why is it white and that the lungs are black? Why does it look like this, Joe? So the denser the material, it absorbs the X-ray, and so it comes up white. The less dense the material, the X-rays pass through, and it comes up black. Okay? So density. So there's a lot of dense tissue there, right? And you see the vertebrae in the back. You can actually see the rib cage, right? And you see part of the anterior part of the xiphoid, of the sternum, and down to the xiphoid process. Okay? So the heart sits within the mediastinum, this middle opening, which is kind of wrapped around, the lungs kind of wrap around it. Okay? The diaphragm. So here's the apex. Up here is the base. And this right here, I'm going to do it in blue. That muscle is your diaphragm. Okay? And it sits on top, right on top of the diaphragm. Okay? Questions on where the heart is in the chest cavity. So, the cardiovascular system includes the heart as being the pump. Okay, so we have the pump, and then we have vessels, cardiovascular vessels. We're going to talk about vessels separately in a separate chapter. We'll mention them now because they're important. Okay, well, major vessels are arteries and veins. And we're going to talk about the major vessels of the heart in a second, but arteries carry blood away from the heart. Artery away, easy to remember. Most of the time, arteries are going to be depicted in red in your pictures because they carry oxygenated blood. Most of the time, not all of the time. You'll see, we'll go over one of those exceptions today. All right, and veins, on the other hand, they carry deoxygenated blood. And they carry blood in which direction? Olivia? Arteries away, veins too. Yes. All right, veins bring blood back to the heart, mainly deoxygenated blood. And the other part where most of the physiology of the cardiovascular system happens is in the capillaries, right? And these are small, thin-walled tubes where exchange occurs in tissues. All right, so where exchange occurs with systemic cells and also within the lungs. All right, so that allows exchange between the blood and the body tissues, body cells, and exchange between the blood and the air that is within the alveoli that you see right here. Okay, so this is alveoli within the lungs, and you see those capillaries. That's exchange with the air sacs of the lungs, right? Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Questions on the basics in terms of vessels? So we're going to start with the top of the heart, okay? The heart, it is the pump. It is a two-sided pump, okay, with 4 distinct chambers. The right side of the heart pumps mainly deoxygenated blood to the lungs. That's driving what we call the pulmonary circuit, okay? And then that newly oxygenated blood comes from the lungs into the left atrium on the left side of the heart, which now pumps blood out to the systemic circuit, okay? And then it comes back around as it comes through, okay? The sides are divided by a muscle or a wall that actually goes through the middle. Okay, it goes through the middle of the heart to separate it. So there's no mixing of blood from right side to left side. Okay, this is what we call the septum. And that septum is divided into different parts. It could be interatrial. What does interatrial mean? Between what? The atrium. And then you have interventricular. Oh, there's an R in there. Okay, and that so it extends from the atrium all the way down to through the ventricles. Okay? Basic orientation of the heart. This point, which is orientated to the inferior and to the left side. It points down towards the left hip. That is the apex. So that's right here. This is the apex. And up here, this whole thing where most of the vessels are, that is the base of the heart. Okay? So the base is what? Give me a directional term that will tell me where it is. Superior. Okay? And the apex of the heart basically sits right. So, with that, we move on to the veins and the major vessels. Okay? So, blood has to come into the heart and then it's pumped out. Okay? We're going to start here with blood coming from the body. All right? So, you have a couple major vessels here. You have the superior vena cava, okay, and the inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava drain blood from the head and shoulders area, okay, above the heart. So everything above the heart, head, and both arms eventually gets into the superior vena cava, okay? All the blood from the legs and the internal organs below the heart get drained by the inferior vena cava. So I always say legs, and then we say inferior organs. Okay? And then from there, the blood enters into what? The right atrium. That's this right here. Right atrium. From the right atrium, blood passes through a valve. We'll go over the valves in a little bit. To the right ventricle. Okay, so this is your right ventricle right here. Okay. And then blood from the right ventricle is pumped out through what? What's this in yellow? It is not the tricuspid valve. What semilunar valve? Pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay? And so then it enters the big vessel right here. This vessel in green, that is your pulmonary trunk. Okay? And from there, those pulmonary veins, pulmonary arteries, that branches into pulmonary arteries away, are carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. All right? And now, in the lungs, what happens? Gas exchange, right? The blood becomes oxygenated. Oxygen is loaded onto hemoglobin, and now it has to come back from the lungs, back towards the heart, from the pulmonary veins. Okay, pulmonary veins. Into the left atrium. Okay? Blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle. That is this right here. And you'll note the thickness of the wall. And then blood is pumped from the left ventricle out through these two guys right here. You can kind of see them right there. What is that? Joe? Yep. What's the semilunar valves in which vessel? Into the aorta, right? So blood comes out through here and eventually out this way. Okay? So this is the aorta. This large vessel right here, which comes out of the base area of the trunk, right? Comes the superior aspect, breaks off into a couple different branches, right? Brachiocephalic, common carotid, left subclavian, and then takes a full-on turn and becomes the descending aorta, which you see goes around the back side of the heart. Okay? So the aorta is the most pressurized vessel, has the highest blood pressure in the system. Okay? So if you look in lab, you'll note the aorta is very, very thick, right? Because of the pressure that's going to be produced from the heart pumping blood out. Questions on that so far? So we went semilunar valves, left ventricle, right ventricle. We'll go over some more stuff in a minute as we move through. Okay? The valves. Okay? You have semilunar valves, the pulmonary semilunar valve, which separates the pulmonary trunk from the what? Right ventricle. Okay? And then you have the aortic semilunar valve, which separates the aorta from the left ventricle. There are atrioventricular valves. Atrioventricular valves. And we're going to go in valves in a little bit detail later. Right? Atrioventricular, you have one on the left, one on the right. You'll note the one on the left separates left atrium from left ventricle. Okay, that is called what? The one on the left is called the bicuspid, also mitral valve. Okay, the one on the right is the tricuspid valve. Okay, so but what is the overall purpose of these valves? To prevent backflow. Okay, they close so that blood does not flow in the opposite direction. We want blood to continuously flow through the pump, right? So that it's always going in one direction through the pump. Atria to ventricles, out the vessels, right? We don't want any backflow. Okay? What this does, the structure of the heart provides a two-sided pump for two separate circuits. Okay? You have your systemic circuit, which is the left side, and the pulmonary circuit, which is powered by the right of the heart. This is what the circuits look like. Okay? So, if we start blood flowing through, you can see see here where gas exchange occurring. We start the right atrium to the right ventricle, out to the lungs, right? Gas exchange occurs, then it comes back from the lungs into the left atrium, left ventricle, out to the body. Okay, both up, and they break it into two different parts because it separates into two different, right? Then from the body comes back to the right side. Okay, the left side is your systemic circuit. blood is leaving the left ventricle and going to somewhere in the body. Okay? And then the pulmonary circuit on the right side. Blood is returning back to the heart, deoxygenated, and then the right ventricle is going to pump blood to the lungs before it comes back to the left atrium. Okay? So I'm going to give you 3 minutes. I want you to follow the path of blood. Right? So, let's say, follow the path of a blood cell starting at, where do we want to start? Pick a point. Joe, pick a point. Right ventricle, okay. Starting at the right ventricle and ending at the right ventricle. Where does it go from there, and what major landmarks does it cross? Write it down. Ready, set, go. I'm going to do it on, actually I'm going to do it on the, if I mention, I ask you to put down those landmarks, I expect valves, right? And major vessels. So you would put pulmonary trunk, you would put aorta, you put the semilunar valves, you put the tricuspid, bicuspid valves in there, right? And then to the lungs and from the lungs. That's all I'm looking for. I'll review those. The point of this for you to kind of go through it. Okay? Here is the blood flow through the pulmonary circulation, and it gives you how it goes through so you can study it. All right? Both of these slides, both the pulmonary and then the systemic circuit. Okay? Now you don't have it also includes in here arteries and capillaries and then so on. One thing we did not talk about is that part of this systemic circuit, okay, includes the heart, right? We did not include and talk about the vessels that actually deliver blood to the heart, okay, and return blood from the heart. The heart's a tissue, it needs nourishment, nutrients as well, right? So there are coronary arteries, one of which comes directly off of the aorta as it exits the heart and delivers blood to the heart, splits into a couple different branches. We'll go over that. And then there's also cardiac veins, which return blood back to the heart from the heart tissue, and that collects in what's called the coronary sinus, which is on the posterior aspect of the heart and also then empties into the what? Right atrium. Good. Okay? So, we talked about the fact that the heart is within the mediastinum. It's kind of wrapped. You'll see that it is just beneath the sternum. The apex points to the left, and the inferior sits on top of the diaphragm. Right? Within the thoracic cavity, there are membranes that line the cavity and also line and cover the organs. Okay? So we're going to talk about these. There's membranes that line the organ. What organ is this? The lung. What membranes line the lung? Olivia. You said it. Pleura. Well, I wouldn't call on you if you weren't going to get it right. Okay? So you have the pleura. Right? And there's two types. There's two flavors of pleura. There's one that lines the cavity. Okay? That is called the parietal pleura. And the ones that cover the lung itself is the visceral pleura. Okay? But the heart actually, and you can see it's cut, you might be able to see it, it's actually cut away. The heart lies within the mediastinum in another membrane called the pericardium. Okay? The pericardium. So it's a three-layered what we call fibroserous membrane. Okay? What was the point of the pleura? What do they do here?
Reduce friction.
It reduces friction by yes. How? Emma, it produces fluid. Okay? So it produces fluid, the lungs move, and they slide across. We'll talk about how the pleura are important for maintaining adequate pressure for breathing, right, when we get to the respiratory system, right? But it allows for the lungs to move across the membrane and reduce friction so there's no problems. Well, the heart is within this and also moves. It contracts, it beats, right? And the pericardium also helps reduce friction of the heart muscle inside it, within the pericardium. So imagine the pericardium is this kind of fluid-filled sac that the heart is encircled in. Okay? So you have this pericardium, and it encircles the whole heart. Part of it is fibrous. You end up with this, with the fibrous pericardium, which gives it a finite size. Okay? It has a finite volume. That part of it is actually continuous with the other two layers. So he's talked about parietal and visceral pleura. Well, there's parietal and visceral pericardium as well. Okay? So you have a fibrous pericardium, and then the other part of it is a serous pericardium that has two layers, a parietal and a visceral. The parietal is the outside. That's what you see here. The parietal layer of the pericardium ends up being, like this, is out here. Okay, and the visceral layer ends up is the actual surface of the heart, also known as the epicardium. And what do you think is between those two layers, those two serous layers of the pericardium? Fluid. Okay? Pericardial, right? Fluid. Contains serous fluid. That's a good thing. It reduces friction, right? But it's also could be a problematic thing. Because sometimes the fluid is produced within that finite space of the fibrous pericardium and produces too much pressure on the heart. Okay? And that's something called pericarditis. We'll talk about it in a second. All right, questions on that? So the epicardium is the outer layer, is a visceral pericardium, right? It ends up being what we see in your heart dissection as the outside, very outside of the heart tissue that you dissected, or you will dissect in lab the rest of this week. Okay? So pericarditis, it's a clinical problem which can cause something called cardiac tamponade. Okay? Where the fluid builds up within the pericardium and puts an undue amount of pressure on the heart. The heart likes to contract and relax in a certain amount, right? So that a fixed volume of blood goes out of the heart every beat. Okay? It does that in order to meet the demands of your cells, of your body. Okay? If you have higher demands, the heart beats faster. That's when you're exercising. It beats faster. It might beat harder to push more blood out to help deliver all the stuff that needs to be delivered to you. Okay? But if you have too much fluid around the heart, it limits how well that heart can contract and push fluid out. Okay? So it becomes a real space as it fills with fluid, so it kind of fills up and it causes cardiac tamponade. And then in that case, the heart's unable to pump. So what do you have to do as a clinician? What do you have to do? You have to drain the fluid. Okay? And in an emergent situation, what that means is you take a needle, put it right underneath the second rib into the pericardium, and drain the fluid. Now, you be a trained individual if you want to do that. Okay? And then there's also something called the friction rub that's also associated with it, right? You use a stethoscope to auscultate and listen to the heart sounds. You can actually hear when the heart contracts if there's too much pressure that it will rub against the sides of the pericardium, right? The pericardial layers rub against one another. All right, so pericarditis, inflammation of the pericardium, and that can be for lots of different reasons. It's like viruses, bacteria, fungi. It could be in response to other systemic problems in the body. Okay? Pericardium. Question pericardium. All right, let's look at some of the anatomy on the outside of the heart. We have the vessels. Above the atria are these tissue-looking things. Kind of look like fat, but they're not. Right? Those are called auricles. And they determine, or they actually show where the atria are in the heart. Okay? And then you have your coronary vessels, right? So left and right coronary arteries, and they are overlaid with the cardiac veins. All right? And they sit in what's called the coronary sulcus, or in this case, the interventricular sulcus. So what is a sulcus from the nervous system? From the brain? It's a depression. Okay? So you have these depressions where the coronary arteries sit. Right? And if you look, I would suggest in lab, you pick up the heart, you can kind of feel, if you follow your thumb down the coronary arteries, you can feel the sulcus that are there, that's kind of sitting in. Okay? We went over the trunk. You see different pulmonary trunk, the vessels, inferior and superior vena cava. You have the aorta. This is the ascending aorta. It's going up. Then the aortic arch, it bends down. And then it actually, if you took the heart out, it goes right down through the the abdomen and through the diaphragm. That's the descending aorta. And then you have the different coronary arteries that are there. Okay? Questions on the outside. Main thing is the auricles as a big difference. All right? This is showing you a cadaver heart. Auricles, atriums, the interventricular sulcus, the coronary arteries that are left and right, and you can see where they go to the heart. Okay? Questions? Pretty straightforward anatomy, right? If we look on the posterior side, the important thing to see here is here's where the cardiac veins come together. Okay, the cardiac veins come together behind the heart. So this is posterior. Behind the heart, there's a coronary sinus. Okay, so blood pools there as it's being returned from the heart tissue before it empties into the right atrium right behind the vena cava right here. Okay, here are your pulmonary veins. They're going to empty blood into where? The left atrium. All right, left pulmonary artery. Blood leaves what chamber of the heart and goes into the pulmonary artery? Right ventricle. All right, good. And again, cadaver view, you can kind of see it's not as pretty as the pictures that we give to you, right? It's kind of messed up. You see, you can make out the pulmonary arteries, right? Atria, here's the inferior vena cava, empties into the right atrium, right? And then the coronary arteries. You can kind of see the coronary sinus here. It's not very definitive as what you see right here in the coronary sinus. Okay? Questions? Awesome. So, over time, actually, there's been a lot of press with teenagers who have suddenly died, especially during athletic events, all right, or athletic strenuous activity, athletic activity. Okay, so this is sudden cardiac death, all right, and usually this is due to undetected cardiovascular disease. Okay, and I'll talk about this as Joe's gone. Who else was in my? Gianna, hi. What's my favorite college football? college period? What? The Gators. Okay? And for my Gators this year, we had a 5-star receiver, right? So we'll recruit. He was supposed to be really good, 6'5", really, right? He came in as a freshman. Second week, they had to put him down. I don't mean put him down like a dog. Like they had to shut him down. That was bad terminology. They had to shut him down. They couldn't play him anymore. Okay, because they based on a physical, he had some symptoms that kind of would signify some cardiovascular problems. Okay, he had a high heart rate. He had elevated heart rate, sweating, shortness of breath, etc. They get him checked out. He can no longer play football anymore. Okay, promise of an NFL, a promise of an NFL career, but he can no longer play football at all because they discovered some underlying cardiovascular disease that could result in death. Okay, so what you end up with is a result of usually it's a result of cardiomegaly, which means a really increased thickness and size of the heart. Right, and symptoms include swelling, dizziness, arrhythmia, and shortness of breath. Okay, and it is revealed by a standard X-ray and confirmed by echocardiogram. What's an echocardiogram? ECG. What is it? What is it going to look at? You've all seen it. Looks something like this. Right? That's a PQRST wave. And what it measures is the electrical impulses that happen in the heart. And we're going to go over that probably Monday of next week. Okay? So, PQRST waves. All right? And it's confirmed to show that there's a problem. Okay? And so there's enlarged thickness of the heart, enlargement of the wall can cause problems, and they eventually can cause the cardiac arrest. The heart wall is made up of cardiac muscle, and the heart tissue itself has 3 layers. Okay, the first layer we already talked about. That's the epicardium. Okay, which is made up of the serous membrane, so it's epithelial tissue, simple squamous epithelial tissue that produces serous fluid. Okay, there's some connective tissue that pervades that, but that's the visceral layer of the epicardium. Okay? And then underneath that is the muscular layer, or the myocardium. Right? Made up of cardiac muscle. Right? Cardiac muscle cells, which are uninucleated, they're striated, and have unique connections called what? Intercalated discs, right? So you see that right here. So here's an intercalated disc. Okay? These cells can also be branched, right? They are branched, so they can have multiple connections to other cells. Right? That's important in how they function. They are involuntary control. And on the inner surface is another layer of simple squamous epithelial system, the endothelium, which is also continuous with what the inside of your blood vessels, the endothelial lining, right? And simple squamous, that's called the endocardium. So think about that as being the inside of the ventricles, right? The surface of the inside of the ventricles, inside of the atrium that are present. Those are your 3 layers of the heart. Layers of the heart wall. Okay? Heart itself is different. Okay, the heart wall changes depending upon where you're looking. Okay? So the epicardium's on the outside, myocardium is the muscle, endocardium is inside surface. What do you notice about the muscle of the heart here? What side's thicker and where? The left side, so which would be this side. Is it the whole left side, or is it one particular chamber? The left ventricle. Okay? And then you have your right ventricle heart wall, which is this. Okay? Why the difference? Why is there such a muscular layer in the left ventricle as opposed to the right ventricle? So there's more pressure, yes. It's gonna help produce more pressure as well, right? What else? Where does it go? Ask someone else. Taylor. It goes out to the body, right? So it has to. Blood's gonna leave the left ventricle and go out the aorta, right, like this. And there you have those 3 branches right there, and then descending aorta, right? And I told you this is the highest pressure inside, and then it has to produce all the pressure that pushes blood out to all the capillaries of the body. Okay, so high pressure, and that that wall is muscle, or highly muscle, thicker muscle to produce that pressure. What about the atria? Why do they have thin muscle walls? Where are they pumping blood? Think about where they're pumping blood to. They're gonna go with gravity, and it's a very short distance, right? They're only pumping blood, from the right atria to the right ventricle, and to the left atria to the left ventricle. It's not far. Okay? And now the right ventricle is only gonna have to pump blood to where? The lungs, which is, last time I checked, it's pretty close, right? It's right there. So think about the distance that has to travel. And so as distance is important when we talk about pressure. The further away you are from the pump, the less and less pressure you have. Okay? So the right ventricle only has to pump blood a short distance, so it doesn't need to have that amount of force. Okay? If the left ventricle has to pump everything to the head against gravity, right, and out to the feet, they have to have some amount of force that goes with it. Okay? Here's the internal part. You're responsible for all of that. Okay? We went over most of it. Interatrial septum, right? Here's your interventricular septum, pericardial sac, right? Couple things. The fossa ovalis, this thing right here. Okay? That is this little hole. Well, it's a little depression. Okay? Which is the remnant of a hole that was within the septum of the atria. Okay? Fetal circulation. The way blood goes in the fetus, right? Who does the oxygenation or gas exchange for the fetus? Mom. Okay? So in the fetal circulation, it's unique because you have oxygenated blood that's actually coming into the right atrium, and then you have this, what was a hole at one point, and so blood comes into the right atrium. Actually, blood comes into the right atrium and then is diverted into the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and then goes out to the fetal circulation, goes out to the baby, right? And then it comes back, right? Comes back through the umbilical veins, goes out to mom, and then comes back this way, okay? Some of the blood does go to the right ventricle and then goes to the lungs of the fetus, but that's not the big important part of it, okay? So the fossa ovalis is the remnant that's left over after that hole closes close to birth, close or just after birth. Okay? Everything else we've kind of talked about. What are these? Actually, let's clear that drawing if I can. What are these right here? So the valves, the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve, right, they prevent backflow. And there's a lot of muscle that's involved here and a lot of pressure that is produced when the heart contracts. And in some cases, these valves cause problems. They actually prolapse, they go backwards. Right? But they have these anchors, these connections, what we call chordinae, tendinae, that hold them in place and help prevent them from prolapsing, okay? And there are muscles that the coordinate tendonae attached to called papillary muscles within the ventricular wall, which again help hold against that pressure, right? The pressure that's being produced within the ventricle. Okay, so those are also called tendinous cords right here. Whoop. Tendinous cords and papillary muscles. Okay, questions? Everything else we've covered. So the valves cover the aortic valves and the semilunar valves, or the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves, the atrioventricular valves. I just said what their job was to do. To do what? Prevent what? Backflow. Okay? So you have the bicuspid and tricuspid looking at them. In some cases, there are problems, right? So we have the cusps and how they close, right? They close in response to a change in pressure, okay? So when the ventricles relax, when the heart's relaxed, they open and there's very little pressure inside the heart, okay? But when they contract, pressure builds up. That pressure inside the ventricles builds up and helps close the atrioventricular valves. It continues to build up. It pushes open the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves, and blood is ejected out of the heart until pressure equalizes in the pulmonary and the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, and then those semilunar valves close to prevent backflow. Right? So you see how it is closed here, right? The shape of them actually helps prevent backflow. Right? That's why it's called a semilunar. Has a crescent shape and will help catch blood as it enters back, as it starts to flow backwards. Okay? Those valves cause your heart sounds, right? It sounds something like this. Lub-dub. Okay, 2 heart sounds. The first sound is the atrioventricular valves closing. That's the hardest sound, right? The second sound is what valves closing? The semilunar valves close. All right? And we talk about this because it is a diagnostic tool to see how well a heart's working. In some cases, you may end up with a heart murmur, which is a disruption in those sounds. The lub-dub, 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 right? We want them to, if there's a whooshing sound or there's a wrong coordination with how they work, the timing is off. That can cause problems. Really, it causes problems with the efficiency of how well the heart is pumping blood and how well it's working. Okay? And sometimes you end up, the murmur could be a result of turbulence. Think about if this valve doesn't close all the way, what happens? The blood flows backwards, right? How many of you all been to the beach or swimming in a pool? Okay, you go underwater. What does it sound like when you're underwater when someone's swimming next to you? You can hear it, right? That's blood swirling around in the ventricles. Okay, and you have 2 types. You have valvular insufficiency or valvular stenosis. Insufficient means the valve's broken and it's not doing its job. It's prolapsing, okay? And so blood is regurgitating back through the valve. Or valvular stenosis, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't flow as well. My question for you is sometimes in valvular insufficiency, you might get enlargement of the heart. Why? Come to class on Friday with an answer for that, okay? Why would you get heart enlargement with valvular insufficiency?